"Arrest that black boy now. He has the device." The words cut through the noise of Hartsfield-Jackson Atlanta International Airport like a siren in the middle of a quiet room. Hundreds of passengers turned their heads at once. Suitcases rolled to a stop. Conversations faded, and in the center of the crowded terminal stood Ethan Carter, a 19-year-old cybersecurity genius with his hands raised, surrounded by airport security officers who already believed they knew the truth. The man pointing at him was Richard Whitmore, one of the most powerful names in American aviation technology. His tailored Navy suit stood out against the gray airport floor. His voice carried the confidence of someone who was used to being obeyed. "That young man was near our security equipment," Richard said firmly. "He has no authorization. He could have put thousands of passengers at risk." Ethan looked around at the faces watching him. Some looked curious. Some looked afraid. Some had already made up their minds. The small device inside a clear evidence bag sat on the table nearby. The same device Ethan had spent the last 3 hours trying to explain was not a threat, but a key to stopping one. "Mr. Whitmore," Ethan said calmly, his voice steady despite the attention around him, "you know exactly why I had that device." Richard's expression hardened. "I know you were where you shouldn't have been." The words landed heavier than Ethan expected. Not because he was surprised, because he remembered when the same man had once looked him in the eye and said something completely different. Months earlier, Ethan Carter had walked into Whitmore Aviation Systems as a college intern from Georgia Institute of Technology. He was young, quiet, and often overlooked. People noticed his age before they noticed his talent. They noticed his clothes before they noticed his skills. But Ethan had never needed a room to recognize his value. He had built security programs from his bedroom in Atlanta, Georgia, and solved complex network problems that experienced engineers struggled with for days. That was how he met the Whitmore family. A dangerous flaw had been discovered inside their company's digital infrastructure, and Ethan was the person who found it before anyone else did. His quick thinking protected sensitive information and saved the company from a disaster that could have cost millions of dollars. Richard Whitmore had shaken his hand afterward. "You saved my family's company," he told him. "I won't forget that." But standing in the airport terminal now, Ethan realized some promises disappear when people see you differently. The announcement speakers above them crackled as passengers waited for updates about delayed flights. Ethan glanced toward the massive digital screens hanging above the terminal. The flashing information was not random. The changes in the system were too precise, too coordinated. His eyes narrowed slightly. "You're making a mistake," Ethan said. "This isn't about me." Richard crossed his arms. "Then what is it about?" Ethan looked at the screens again. "Someone is inside the aviation network." A few passengers nearby stopped recording and looked confused. An airport employee exchanged a glance with another worker. Richard gave a short, dismissive laugh. "You expect everyone here to believe that?" Ethan turned back toward him. "I expect you to check before you accuse." For a moment, the noise of the airport seemed to disappear. Ethan could hear only the hum of the lights above him and the distant sound of aircraft moving outside the terminal windows. He knew what was happening. He knew the system was beginning to fail. And he knew the one person who could help stop it was standing in front of him, choosing to see him as a suspect instead of a solution. Then every screen in the terminal flickered at the same time. The airport fell silent, and Ethan Carter realized the world was about to discover the truth. Before the airport screens began to flicker, before hundreds of strangers looked at Ethan Carter as if he did not belong there, his life had been much quieter. He was not someone who searched for attention. In fact, Ethan had spent most of his life avoiding it. Growing up in Atlanta, Georgia, he learned early that being the smartest person in the room did not always mean being the person people listened to. At 19 years old, Ethan had already discovered something important about the world. People often judged what they could see before they understood what was hidden beneath the surface. His worn backpack, his simple clothes, and his calm personality made some people underestimate him. But behind that quiet expression was a mind that could understand digital systems almost like another language. Ethan was studying cybersecurity at the Georgia Institute of Technology, where professors often noticed his unusual ability to solve problems that seemed impossible. He did not see computer networks as machines. He saw them as connected living systems, each piece depending on another. That ability was what brought him to Whitmore Aviation Systems. 6 months earlier, Ethan had been invited to join a small technology team working on security improvements for the company. It was supposed to be a temporary internship, just a chance for him to gain experience. But within his first week, he noticed something that others had missed. a weakness hidden deep inside the company's security structure. It was not obvious. It was buried under layers of advanced software and expensive protection systems. Several engineers had reviewed the system before him, but they looked at the problem from the outside. Ethan looked at it differently. He asked one simple question. What would happen if someone understood the system better than the people who built it? That question changed everything. He spent 2 nights reviewing thousands of lines of code, checking patterns, and tracing unusual activity. When he finally presented his findings, the room became silent. Richard Whitmore, the founder of Whitmore Aviation Systems, had been sitting at the end of the conference table, surrounded by executives who had worked with him for years. At first, he looked uncertain. He was not used to receiving warnings from a 19-year-old intern. "Are you telling me my security team missed this?" Richard asked. Ethan stayed respectful. "I am saying the problem was hidden well, sir, but it is there." The company's experts checked his work. Then they checked again. Ethan was right. The discovery prevented a major security failure that could have damaged the company's reputation and affected thousands of customers. That was the moment Richard's opinion of Ethan changed. He invited Ethan to his office overlooking downtown Atlanta. The large windows reflected the city lights, and for the first time, Ethan felt like someone saw his ability instead of his appearance. "You have a rare gift," Richard told him. "People spend years learning what you already understand." Ethan simply nodded. "I just like solving problems." Richard smiled. "Never lose that." But the relationship between them became more complicated when Ethan met the rest of the Whitmore family. Richard's wife, Emily, was polite but distant. She admired his intelligence, but seemed uncomfortable with how quickly he gained respect inside a world where he did not look like everyone else. Their son, Lucas Whitmore, was different. Lucas was 21 years old and studying business. Unlike his father, he did not care about status. He remembered Ethan as the person who helped protect his family's company. "You know, my father does not say thank you often," Lucas once told him. Ethan smiled slightly. "He does not have to." Lucas shook his head. "No, he does. He just does not know how." For a while, Ethan believed he had found people who valued him. He believed his work mattered more than people's assumptions. But the same world that praised him when he was useful could change quickly when fear entered the room. And now, standing inside the airport terminal with security officers surrounding him, Ethan realized the person who once thanked him was the same person accusing him. The airport screens continued flashing above them. The warning signs were growing. The system was changing faster than anyone understood. Ethan looked toward Richard and quietly said, "You trusted me when I saved your company. I need you to trust me now before it is too late." But Richard looked away, and in that moment, Ethan understood that proving the truth would be harder than finding it. Richard Whitmore had spent decades building an empire where every decision carried weight. Inside the glass towers of Whitmore Aviation Systems in Atlanta, Georgia, his name opened doors before he even reached them. Executives stood when he entered a room. Investors listened when he spoke. Employees carefully measured every word around him. To the outside world, Richard was a visionary businessman who had transformed a small aviation technology company into one of the most respected names in the industry. But behind the polished image was a man who believed control was the same as strength. He trusted numbers, contracts, and reputation. He trusted people who looked like they belonged in his world. And that belief shaped the way he saw Ethan Carter. At first, Ethan was simply an unexpected talent, a young intern with a remarkable ability to understand complex systems. But as Ethan gained recognition inside the company, some people began asking questions that had nothing to do with his skills. How did someone that young discover something our engineers missed? One executive quietly asked. Another replied, "Maybe he just got lucky." Ethan heard comments like that, but he never allowed them to distract him. He continued working, continued learning, and continued helping wherever he could. Lucas Whitmore noticed that difference. Unlike many people inside the company, Lucas did not see Ethan as a temporary assistant. He saw him as someone who genuinely cared about solving problems. One afternoon, the two stood outside the company cafeteria overlooking the busy streets of downtown Atlanta. Lucas held 2 cups of coffee and handed one to Ethan. "You know what I find interesting about you?" Lucas asked. Ethan looked confused. "What?" "You could have used your talent to make people feel small. A lot of smart people do that. But you do the opposite." Ethan looked down at the coffee cup in his hand. "Knowledge is not useful if you only use it to prove you are better than someone else." Lucas remembered those words. Years later, they would stay with him. But Richard saw the world differently. He measured people by position, influence, and appearance. He was not openly cruel. He smiled during meetings. He shook hands for cameras. He thanked employees during company events. But when pressure arrived, his true priorities became clearer. To Richard, protecting the company's image came before understanding the people inside it. That became obvious during a private meeting weeks before the airport incident. Ethan had discovered unusual activity connected to aviation security network. He prepared a detailed report explaining that someone might attempt to exploit weaknesses in multiple systems. He expected concern. Instead, he received hesitation. Richard sat at the head of the conference table while several senior executives reviewed the information. "You are certain this is a serious issue?" Richard asked. "Yes, sir," Ethan replied. "The pattern is different from normal testing. Someone is searching for access." One executive adjusted his glasses. "Or perhaps the system is showing normal activity, and we are creating unnecessary panic." Ethan remained calm. "I understand the concern. That is why we should investigate before making assumptions." Richard looked at the report again. For a brief moment, Ethan thought he had reached him. But then Richard closed the folder. "We cannot create fear every time someone finds something unusual." Ethan nodded slowly. "Ignoring a warning does not make the danger disappear." The room became quiet. Richard studied him. "You are talented, Ethan, but sometimes talent needs to understand boundaries." Ethan left the meeting knowing something had changed. The same people who celebrated his intelligence now questioned his place. The same company that once needed his skills now treated his warnings like an inconvenience. And yet, Ethan still believed doing the right thing mattered. That belief was why he was at Hartsfield-Jackson Atlanta International Airport on that morning. He was not there for recognition. He was not there to impress anyone. He was there because he saw the signs of a problem that could affect thousands of travelers. But when the moment arrived, Richard Whitmore did not remember the young man who protected his company. He only saw a situation he could not control. And in a world where appearances often speak louder than truth, Ethan was about to learn how quickly gratitude could turn into suspicion. The warning had been sitting inside Ethan Carter's mind long before the airport screens began flashing. He remembered every detail from the moment he first noticed the unusual patterns inside the aviation network. It was not just a technical problem, it was a signal. Someone was testing the system, looking for a way through. Ethan had learned that digital threats rarely announced themselves. They moved quietly, hiding inside normal activity until the damage was already done. That was why he came to Hartsfield-Jackson Atlanta International Airport that morning. He carried a small diagnostic device containing security tools designed to analyze the network and identify the source of the problem. It was not dangerous. It was not a weapon. It was the same type of technology he had used before to protect Whitmore aviation systems. But standing near the security area, Ethan noticed something that made his stomach tighten. The system was changing faster than expected. The information screens displayed delays that did not match the actual flight schedules. Gate assignments shifted without explanation. Communication between departments became slower. Ethan looked around the terminal filled with travelers carrying bags, checking phones, and waiting for their flights. Most of them had no idea anything was wrong. Ethan stepped toward an airport employee. "Excuse me, I need to speak with whoever manages the network systems here," he said. The employee looked at the device in Ethan's hand and became cautious. "What is that?" Ethan immediately explained. "A diagnostic tool. There is unusual activity inside the system, and I believe someone is trying to interfere with airport operations." The employee hesitated. "Are you authorized to run this equipment here?" Ethan opened his mouth to answer, but before he could explain, Richard Whitmore appeared from behind them. He had arrived at the airport for a meeting with aviation partners and was already frustrated by the unexpected delays. His expression changed the moment he saw Ethan. "What is he doing here?" Richard asked. Ethan turned around. "Mr. Whitmore, I am glad you are here. I need you to look at this." Richard did not move closer. Instead, he looked at the device, then at the security officers nearby. "Why does he have company equipment?" Ethan felt the room shift around him. "Because I am trying to prevent a problem." Richard's voice became colder. "Or because you are creating one." The question was louder than necessary. A few people nearby started watching. Ethan looked directly at him. "You know me. You know what I have done for your company?" Richard remained silent for a moment. Then he said something Ethan never expected to hear. "I know what you are capable of. That is exactly why this concerns me." The words carried a different meaning than before. Months ago, Ethan's intelligence had been valuable. Now, the same intelligence made people suspicious. An airport security officer approached. "Sir, we need to understand what is happening." Richard pointed toward the device. He brought unauthorized equipment into a secure area. Ethan immediately shook his head. "That is not what happened. I brought this because the security system is being compromised." The officer looked between them. "Can you prove that?" Ethan turned toward the digital screens above the terminal. They flickered again. This time, more passengers noticed. A child asked a parent why the screen changed. Travelers began looking around, confused by the sudden uncertainty. Ethan lowered his voice. "I can prove it if you let me access the system." Richard stepped forward. "No, you do not get to walk into an airport and take control because you think you are smarter than everyone else." Ethan's expression remained calm, but the disappointment in his eyes was impossible to hide. "This is not about being smarter. It is about being right before something goes wrong." The security officer looked at Richard. "Do you know this young man?" Richard answered quickly. "He was an intern at my company." That single sentence changed the way people looked at Ethan. Not an expert, not a cybersecurity specialist, just an intern. The label became louder than the truth. Ethan watched as assumptions formed around him in real time. He knew he could explain every detail. He knew he could show every line of code and every warning signal. But sometimes facts needed a chance to be heard, and right now, nobody wanted to listen. The airport continued moving around them. Thousands of people walked through the terminal, unaware that the person being treated as a problem might be the only person who understood the solution. Ethan looked once more at the failing screens above him. Then he quietly said, "You do not have much time left." And for the first time, even Richard Whitmore looked uncertain. The airport terminal had changed in only a few minutes. The same place that had been filled with ordinary conversations and the sound of rolling suitcases now carried a different kind of silence. Travelers looked up at the digital boards. Employees moved quickly between gates. Questions spread from one person to another. Nobody knew exactly what was happening, but everyone could feel that something was wrong. Ethan Carter stood near the security checkpoint, watching the system he had warned about begin to fail. He knew every second mattered, but instead of being asked for help, he was being treated as the person responsible. The security officer looked at Ethan's identification and then back at Richard Whitmore. "You are saying he brought unauthorized equipment into a restricted area?" Richard nodded. "Yes. He has access to technical information, and he was near sensitive systems." Ethan looked at Richard with disbelief. "You know that is not the truth." Richard's face remained serious. "Then explain why you are here with that device." Ethan took a breath. He could feel hundreds of eyes on him. "Because someone is attacking the airport network. I came here to help stop it." A few passengers nearby exchanged doubtful looks. To them, Ethan was not a cybersecurity expert. He was just a young man holding a device they did not understand. The appearance of the situation became stronger than the reality. The security officer asked, "Do you have official authorization from the airport?" Ethan paused. He knew the answer would not satisfy them. Not from the airport. "From Whitmore Aviation Systems," Richard immediately interrupted. "He no longer works with our company." The statement hit harder than Ethan expected. It was true. His internship had ended weeks earlier, but the way Richard said it made it sound like Ethan was a stranger. Like their history meant nothing. Ethan looked at him quietly. "You called me when your company needed help." Richard looked away. "This is different." Ethan lowered his voice. "No, it is exactly the same. The only difference is that now you are afraid." The security officer stepped between them. "Sir, we need everyone to cooperate." Ethan nodded. "I am cooperating. I am trying to prevent a larger problem." Then another screen above the terminal went dark. The sound of confused passengers grew louder. Flight information disappeared for several seconds before returning with incorrect details. Airport employees began checking their systems. A supervisor approached quickly. "We are having communication issues across several departments." Ethan turned toward the supervisor. "That is the beginning. The system is losing synchronization." The supervisor looked surprised. "How do you know that?" Ethan pointed toward the screens. "Because the errors are not random. Someone is forcing the system to question its own data." The explanation was clear. It was technical. It made sense. But Richard still hesitated. The fear of admitting Ethan was right was stronger than the desire to listen. "You are making assumptions," Richard said. Ethan looked at him. "And you are ignoring evidence." The two men stood in the middle of the crowded terminal, separated by more than just a few feet. They were separated by everything they represented. One had wealth, influence, and a name recognized across the aviation industry. The other had knowledge, patience, and a truth nobody wanted to accept. Then Ethan's phone received an alert. He checked the screen. His expression changed. The situation was moving faster than he expected. "The backup systems are being targeted now," he said. The supervisor looked at him. "Can you stop it?" Ethan answered honestly. "Yes, but I need access." Richard stepped forward. "Absolutely not." Ethan turned slowly. "Why?" Richard's answer came quickly. "Because if you are wrong, you could make everything worse." Ethan stared at him for a moment. "And if I am right?" Richard had no answer. The silence between them said everything. Around them, the airport continued to struggle. Thousands of passengers waited without knowing that the person they suspected was the one person who could protect them. Ethan looked toward the security team and then toward the failing systems. He was not angry. He was not trying to prove anyone wrong. He simply knew what needed to be done. "I do not need you to trust me forever," Ethan said quietly. "I only need you to trust me long enough to save this." But before anyone responded, another warning appeared across the main screen. The entire terminal watched as the problem became impossible to ignore. And finally, the people who refused to believe Ethan began to realize they might have been wrong. The warning on the main screen changed everything. For a moment, nobody in the terminal spoke. The flashing message reflected across hundreds of faces, showing the same confusion that had been building for the past several minutes. Airport employees moved faster. Passengers looked at their phones. Families gathered closer together, searching for answers. But in the middle of all that uncertainty, Ethan Carter remained still. He was not watching the crowd. He was watching the system, the patterns, the failures, the small signs that told him exactly what was happening behind the screens. The attack was no longer hidden. It was active. A supervisor from the airport technology department rushed toward the security checkpoint. "What is happening?" he asked. One employee quickly explained, "The network is unstable. Several systems are not communicating correctly." The supervisor looked toward Ethan. "Can you help?" Before Ethan could answer, Richard Whitmore stepped forward. "Wait, we do not know who this young man is or what he has done." The supervisor looked confused, but he said he understands the system. Richard replied, "He was an intern. That does not make him responsible for solving this." Ethan heard the words, but this time they did not surprise him. He had already seen the change in Richard. The person who once called him talented now reduced him to a title. An intern. A young man, someone people did not expect to have the answer. Ethan looked down briefly at his hands. The same hands that had written the security improvements that protected Whitmore aviation systems. The same hands that had spent countless nights studying code while others were sleeping. The same hands that had tried to warn them before the crisis arrived. For a few seconds, the noise of the airport faded away. The announcements overhead became distant. The footsteps around him became quieter. Ethan remembered why he started learning cybersecurity in the first place. It was not for recognition. It was not for money. It was because he believed technology should protect people. His grandmother used to tell him, "The person who knows the solution has a responsibility to share it." Those words stayed with him. Even now, even here. Ethan looked back at the supervisor. "I can help you stabilize the system, but I need temporary access." The supervisor hesitated. "How long would it take?" Ethan looked at the information changing on the screens. "I do not know exactly, but every minute we wait makes recovery harder." Richard stepped closer. "You are asking them to give access to someone who was just identified as a security concern." Ethan turned toward him. His voice remained calm. "I was identified as a concern because you made an assumption before checking the facts." The sentence was quiet, but it carried through the space between them. Several people nearby heard it. Even the security officers paused. The supervisor looked between Ethan and Richard. He could see the tension, but he could also see the failing systems around him. Finally, he made a decision. "Give him limited access." Richard immediately objected. "You are making a mistake." The supervisor answered, "Maybe, but doing nothing is also a choice." Ethan was escorted to a nearby technical station. The bright glow of computer screens illuminated his face. Around him, the airport continued moving through uncertainty. But Ethan entered a world he understood. Numbers, patterns, connections. The confusion around him disappeared. His fingers moved across the keyboard as he studied the system architecture. He did not rush. He did not panic. He followed the information carefully, tracing the problem back through layers of security. A technician standing beside him watched in silence. After several moments, he whispered, "How are you seeing this so quickly?" Ethan did not look away from the screen. "Because the system is not broken. Someone is forcing it to behave like it is." The technician looked surprised. What does that mean? Ethan paused. It means someone wants everyone to look at the failure instead of the person causing it. Behind them, Richard watched from a distance. For the first time that day, doubt appeared on his face. Not doubt about Ethan's ability, doubt about his own judgment. The young man he had dismissed was sitting there calmly working to solve the problem everyone else was struggling to understand. Ethan continued analyzing the network, knowing the hardest part was still ahead. But for the first time since arriving at the airport, someone had finally given him the chance to prove what he had been saying all along. The airport terminal had never felt so quiet. The sound of rushing footsteps, confused conversations, and distant announcements surrounded Ethan Carter, but inside his mind there was only focus. Every line of information on the screen connected to another. Every error had a reason. Every delay had a pattern. Ethan was no longer trying to convince people that something was wrong. He was already inside the problem, searching for the answer. The technician beside him watched as the young man moved through the system with a confidence that seemed impossible for someone his age. "How are you finding these connections?" the technician asked. Ethan kept his eyes on the screen, because whoever designed this attack understood the system. They know where people usually look, so they hid the problem somewhere nobody would expect. The technician leaned closer. "Can you stop it?" Ethan paused for a moment. He studied the data moving across the screen. Then he answered, "Yes. But first I need to understand who created it." Across the terminal, Richard Whitmore stood near the security area, watching silently. The same man who had once invited Ethan into his office was now watching him through a completely different lens. Richard remembered the first time Ethan showed him the hidden weakness inside Whitmore Aviation Systems. He remembered the young intern standing in front of a room full of experienced engineers, explaining a problem everyone else had missed. At that moment, Richard saw brilliance. Now, standing in the airport, he saw a situation he did not understand, and that uncertainty made him uncomfortable. Lucas Whitmore arrived at the terminal after hearing what happened. The moment he saw Ethan working at the technical station, he walked toward his father. "Dad, what are you doing?" Richard looked at him, handling a security issue. Lucas looked around at the airport screens, then back at Ethan. "You mean Ethan?" Richard remained silent. Lucas lowered his voice. "He saved our company," Richard replied. "That does not mean we ignore procedures." Lucas shook his head. "No, but it also does not mean we ignore him." Ethan continued working. He found unusual activity hidden beneath layers of normal communication. Someone had created a false trail, making it appear like a technical failure was happening naturally. But Ethan noticed something others missed. The pattern was too organized, too deliberate. He followed the trail deeper, then he stopped. His expression changed. "I found something." The technician looked over. "What is it?" Ethan pointed to the screen. The attack did not begin here. The technician studied the information. "Then where?" Ethan followed the digital path backward. "Whitmore Aviation Systems." The words created a new silence. Richard heard them from several feet away. "That is impossible," he said. Ethan turned around. "No, sir. It is unlikely, but it is not impossible." Richard walked closer. "Are you saying my company caused this?" Ethan shook his head. "No, I am saying someone used your company's access points." The difference mattered. Ethan was not searching for someone to blame. He was searching for the truth. The technician continued reviewing the information. "There is another issue. Someone used internal credentials." Richard's expression changed. "Whose credentials?" Ethan looked at the screen. "Someone with high-level access." The room became still. Everyone understood what that meant. The problem was not just outside the system. It came from someone who knew how the system worked. Richard looked at Ethan carefully. "Can you identify the person?" Ethan continued analyzing the data. "I can try." Minutes passed. The airport waited. Travelers waited. Thousands of people depended on a solution they did not know was happening. Finally, Ethan found the connection. His eyes moved across the screen. "I know who created the access point." The technician looked at him. "Who?" Ethan did not answer immediately. He looked toward Richard. "Someone connected to your company." Richard's confidence disappeared. For the first time, he was not looking at Ethan as a possible threat. He was looking at him as the person who had uncovered the truth. Ethan turned back to the screen and continued working. There was still a system to protect, still people depending on him, and now the same family that once doubted him was about to learn that the person they pushed away was the only one standing between them and a disaster. The truth inside the system was no longer hidden. Ethan Carter had followed the digital trail through layers of security, past false signals and carefully designed distractions, until he found the source of the problem. The person responsible had not attacked from outside. They had used trusted access from within. The discovery changed the atmosphere inside Hartsfield-Jackson Atlanta International Airport. The people who had watched Ethan with suspicion were now watching him with questions. The same young man they had surrounded moments earlier was now the person revealing what was happening behind the scenes. The technician beside Ethan looked at the screen again, unable to hide his surprise. "This access came from inside Whitmore Aviation Systems?" he asked. Ethan nodded. "Yes. Someone used an authorized account to create a hidden pathway into the network." Richard Whitmore stepped closer. His confidence had disappeared. "Are you certain?" Ethan looked at him calmly. "I checked the pattern 3 times. I do not make accusations without evidence." Those words stayed in the air. Ethan was doing exactly what Richard had failed to do. He was searching for facts before judgment. The supervisor from the airport technology department leaned toward the screen. "Can you identify the person behind it?" Ethan continued analyzing the information. "Not yet, but I can isolate the access point." His fingers moved carefully across the keyboard. He was not rushing. He was not trying to prove himself. He was simply doing the work he came there to do. Around him, the airport continued waiting. Thousands of passengers remained unaware of how close the system had come to a major disruption. A mother held her child's hand while checking a delayed flight. A business traveler refreshed his phone repeatedly, hoping for updates. An elderly couple sat quietly near a gate, trusting that someone was working to fix the problem. Ethan saw all of them. That was why he stayed focused. He was not thinking about Richard's accusation anymore. He was thinking about the people who depended on the system working correctly. After several moments, Ethan found another piece of information. His expression changed slightly. "I found the entry point." The technician looked at him. "Where?" Ethan turned the screen so others could see. "A remote maintenance account connected to Whitmore Aviation Systems." Richard's face became serious. "That account belongs to my company." Ethan nodded. "Yes, then someone inside my company did this." Ethan looked at him. "Someone with access. We still need to know why." Richard remained silent. For years, he had believed protecting his company meant controlling the story, protecting the image, protecting the reputation. But standing there, watching Ethan solve the problem, he realized something uncomfortable. The truth had never needed his permission. Lucas moved closer to his father. "Dad, you need to listen to him." Richard looked at his son. "I should have listened earlier." It was the first time Richard admitted uncertainty, the first crack in the confidence that had surrounded him for years. Ethan continued working. He located the final sequence of commands controlling the system disruption. He studied the information carefully. Then he saw something unexpected. "This was not designed to destroy the system," Ethan said. The technician looked confused. "What do you mean?" Ethan pointed at the screen. "The goal was to lock everyone out and create confusion. Whoever did this wanted people to panic and make mistakes." Richard asked quietly, "Can you stop it?" Ethan looked at the remaining indicators. "Yes, but I need full cooperation from everyone." The supervisor immediately approved the request. Airport engineers connected with Ethan's instructions. For the first time that day, people were no longer questioning his place. They were following his guidance. The same person who had been treated like a threat was now leading the response. Ethan worked through the final steps while the terminal waited. The screens above slowly began returning to normal. Flight information stabilized. Communication systems reconnected. The noise of uncertainty began to fade. A few passengers noticed the changes and started moving again. The airport was breathing again. Richard stood several feet away, watching Ethan. He remembered the moment he pointed at him and assumed the worst. He remembered believing a title mattered more than character. Now he saw the reality clearly. Ethan was never the danger. Ethan was the reason thousands of people were safe. And before the day was over, Richard Whitmore would have to face everyone and admit the person he doubted was the person who saved them. The airport slowly returned to normal. The flashing warnings disappeared from the screens above the terminal, flight information stabilized, and the confused voices of thousands of passengers began turning back into ordinary conversations. The crisis that had filled the building with uncertainty was fading, but the truth that came with it remained impossible to ignore. Ethan Carter stood at the technical station, looking at the final confirmation on the screen. The system was secure. The threat had been stopped. The same young man who had been surrounded by suspicion was now the reason everything was working again. The supervisor approached Ethan and looked at him with a different expression than before. It was no longer doubt. It was respect. "You saved us valuable time," the supervisor said. Ethan simply nodded. "I was just trying to help." Those simple words revealed something important about Ethan. He was not searching for praise. He was not waiting for an apology. He had never been there to prove that he was better than anyone else. He was there because people needed someone to act. Across the terminal, Richard Whitmore stood quietly. The noise around him seemed distant. He watched passengers continue their journeys, completely unaware of how close the airport had come to a major disruption. He thought about everything that happened that day. The moment he saw Ethan and assumed the worst. The moment he allowed fear and appearance to influence his judgment. The moment he forgot the young man standing in front of him was the same person who once protected his company. Lucas walked beside his father. "Dad," he said softly. Richard looked at him. "I was wrong." Lucas did not respond immediately. Those words were rare coming from Richard Whitmore. For years, Richard had built his life around being confident, around having answers, around being the person others depended on. But admitting a mistake required something different. It required humility. Richard walked toward Ethan slowly. The airport lights reflected across the polished floor as people moved around them. For the first time that day, there was no security officer between them. No accusation, no assumption, just two people standing face to face. "Ethan," Richard said. Ethan turned around. Richard paused before speaking. "I owe you an apology." Ethan remained quiet. Richard continued. "I saw your appearance before I saw your character. I saw your age before I saw your ability. And today, I almost ignored the person who was trying to protect everyone." Ethan looked at him carefully. The apology was not something he expected, but he understood that recognition mattered. "I appreciate you saying that," Ethan replied. Richard lowered his head slightly. "You saved my company before. Today, you saved far more than that." Ethan looked toward the terminal filled with travelers. Everyone deserves to be heard before they are judged. The sentence stayed with Richard. It was not angry. It was not a demand for revenge. It was simply the truth. Later that afternoon, news of what happened at Hartsfield, Jackson Atlanta International Airport, spread quickly. Officials confirmed that the young cybersecurity specialist who helped restore the system had prevented a much larger disruption. Reports did not focus on where Ethan came from. They focused on what he did. His name appeared beside words like intelligence, responsibility, and courage. But Ethan did not let the attention change him. A few days later, he returned to Georgia Institute of Technology and walked through the same campus paths he had walked before. Students passed by carrying books and coffee, unaware that one of their classmates had recently protected thousands of travelers. Ethan still carried the same backpack. He still preferred quiet places. He still believed knowledge mattered most when it helped others. Meanwhile, Richard Whitmore changed the way he looked at leadership. He created a new program at Whitmore Aviation Systems to recognize talent based on ability instead of background. During the announcement, he mentioned Ethan's work and admitted that the greatest lesson he learned was not about technology. It was about people. Months later, Ethan returned to the airport for a cybersecurity conference. He stood near the same terminal where everything had changed. The same floors, the same lights, the same moving crowds. But this time, nobody looked at him with suspicion. People recognized him as someone who had helped protect them. Ethan looked out through the large airport windows at the planes moving across the runway. He did not smile because he had proven others wrong. He smiled because he had stayed true to himself. The world had finally seen what had always been there. Not just a brilliant mind, not just a talented programmer, but a young man who chose responsibility over resentment and kindness over anger. And sometimes, the quietest person in the room is the one who has the power to change everything.